Let's get one thing clear right away. If you think forgetting deodorant for a day is bad, try forgetting it for an entire century, which is essentially what medieval Europe did. Hygiene back then wasn't a ritual of self-care or an expression of dignity. It was more like a cautious negotiation with fate, religion, and, frankly, your own armpits. Today, you might start your morning with a hot shower, some floral shampoo, maybe a lavender scented lotion to follow. In the 14th century, your idea of a cleanse was dabbing your face with a damp cloth while hoping the river you drew it from wasn't upstream of a tannery, a butcher shop, or, God forbid, the chamber pot district. The truth is, medieval hygiene wasn't a failure of intelligence. It was a triumph of misunderstanding, a brilliant, almost poetic commitment to getting everything exactly wrong about the human body. Hot water, suspicious. Soap, optional. Communal bathing, devilish. And public sanitation. Let's just say the pigs often had better bathroom etiquette. But don't be too quick to judge. These people weren't dirty by choice. They weren't gleefully rolling in the mud or hosting lice salons in their hair for fun. They were doing their best, or what they believed was best, guided by a mixture of superstition, scarcity, ecclesiastical panic, and, occasionally, convenience. In the early Middle Ages, hygiene wasn't yet the enemy. Monasteries still carried faint echoes of Roman bathing culture. Monks had scheduled wash days, bathhouses flickered with coals and conversation, and cleanliness was almost fashionable. But then came the 13th century, and like all good things, bathhouses, hope, the concept of soap, hygiene began to die a slow, musty death. Why? Fear, mostly. Fear that hot water opened your pores and let illness sneak in like a cunning little goblin. Fear that nudity, even in private, was an invitation to sin. And fear that communal bathhouses, once places of health and gossip, were now dens of debauchery and unclean spirits. You didn't just risk catching something in a bathhouse, you risked becoming something. A sponge for disease, a scandal in a damp towel. By the time the Black Death made its grand rat-born entrance, bathhouses were shutting down faster than you could say moral decay. Water was no longer your friend. It was a threat. And so the people adapted, not with innovation, but with linen, the unsung hero of medieval hygiene. The logic was simple. If you can't clean your body, clean your shirt. A nice white underlayer would soak up all the unpleasantness, and changing it once a week or month, depending on your ambition, was considered the peak of sophistication. You weren't dirty, you were absorbent. And that was close enough. The upper classes fared better, of course. They could afford servants to haul in steaming cauldrons of water, line the wooden tubs with perfumed herbs, and pretend not to gag while scrubbing someone's back with a linen cloth soaked in vinegar. Nobles bathed, occasionally, usually before weddings, court appearances, or spiritual reckonings. It was a luxury, not a lifestyle. For the poor, cleanliness was a group activity, the kind that involved barrels, rivers, and prayers that the goat didn't drink from the same spot. Entire families might bathe together. Not for bonding, mind you, but because fuel was expensive and water was heavy. Why boil it twice when everyone could stew together like a very modest soup? Then there were the monks. God bless them. Or perhaps he already had, because monasteries remained some of the last bastions of scheduled cleanliness. Many monastic rules mandated bathing on holy days or before significant rituals. It was spiritual, of course. But also, nobody wanted to chant next to Brother Edmund if Brother Edmund smelled like sin, cheese, and old wool. Still, for most people, the bath was not a part of daily life. It was a moment. And so, instead of scrubbing, they powdered. They rubbed rose water on their temples, stuffed lavender in their collars, and chewed cloves like their lives. Or at least their breath depended on it. They wore pomanders around their necks, hollow metal balls filled with spices to ward off the stench of others and themselves. Think of it as medieval Febreze, worn like jewelry, inhaled like hope. But we haven't even gotten to the real stars of medieval hygiene, the invisible ones. The crawling, hopping, biting ones. Lice, fleas, mites, tiny roommates that never paid rent but always shared your bed, and a shirt, and occasionally your dignity. You didn't get lice. Like you had shoes or siblings. They were part of the package. If your scalp itched, you combed. If it still itched, you shaved your head. If that failed, you simply learned to coexist, scratching discreetly, nodding politely, and pretending you were thinking about the harvest while trying not to make eye contact with your own color. To understand medieval hygiene, you must understand this. It was a performance, a delicate, fragrant illusion. People didn't strive for sterility, they aimed for presentable decay. You didn't need to smell good. You just needed to smell better than the fishmonger's apprentice. You didn't need to be clean. You just needed to be clean enough to not be exorcised. And so we begin our journey, not into war or politics or grand cathedrals, but into the damp alleys of human maintenance. Into the daily struggle of existing in a world without toothpaste, shampoo, or shame, where linen carried your sins, vinegar masked your failures, and every bath was a gamble against God, disease, and public scandal. Let's say you've been traveling by horseback for 5 days. You've slept in hay, stepped in questionable substances, and your only sustenance was ale, onions, and prayers. You finally reach a town. Do you ask for a tavern? A chapel? No. You ask the question that would have made sense to a Roman but would raise more than eyebrows in medieval Europe. Where's the bathhouse? And the answer, more often than not, would have been shut down. Bathhouses, once the pride of Roman hygiene and early Christian monastic tradition, had, by the High Middle Ages, devolved into places of scandal and suspicion. What began as centers of warmth, conversation, and communal cleanliness soon transformed, not through water, but through rumor, doctrine, and sheer human horniness. In the 9th and 10th centuries, bathhouses were still a thing. Townsfolk would soak in shared wooden tubs, steam together in stone rooms, and rinse with herbal infusions passed down from pagan times. Men, women, monks, merchants, all gathered to wash off the dust of the fields or the sins of the market. It was like a spa, except with more God and fewer cucumbers. The church noticed. The issue wasn't cleanliness per se, it was what happened after the rinse. Some bathhouses began offering additional services. Maciosejos became ambiguous. Candles got dimmer. Rooms got quieter. And suddenly, a steamy bath wasn't just a bath. It was a slippery slope to fornication, heresy, and possibly venereal disease. And let's not forget the science of the time. Bathing was believed to open the pores, a term which, in the medieval mind, meant opening literal gateways to disease. You weren't cleansing your body, you were exposing it. To spirits, to bad air, to God knows what floating in the miasma of existence. Especially during plague years, to bathe was to gamble with death, and not in the fun, sword-fighting kind of way. So, bathhouses were shut. Some were converted. Some became bakeries. Others turned into warehouses. A few brave towns kept theirs running in secret, like some sort of underground hygiene cult. But the mainstream consensus was clear. If God wanted you clean, he'd have invented plumbing. Of course, not everyone was on board with this rejection of the soak. Monasteries in southern Europe, especially in places like Spain or Italy, kept up their bathing rituals, viewing them as spiritual purification. Monks bathed on holy days, before major feasts, or as part of penance. Which meant, yes, if you sinned enough, you could actually earn a bath. That's how upside down this world was. But even within monasteries, bath time was regulated. You weren't exactly doing cannonballs into the tub. It was quiet and deeply awkward, especially if Brother Aloysius had just had garlic soup and decided to sit next to you. Meanwhile, outside the cloisters, noble households kept the practice alive, but bathing became a production. You didn't go to a bath. You summoned it. Servants boiled water in the kitchen, carried it through cold stone corridors, poured it into a linen-lined tub near the fire, and sprinkled it with rosemary or sage. Then they turned their backs and tried not to flinch at what they saw. It was intimate and slightly embarrassing, because despite the luxury, you were still sitting naked in a wooden bucket while someone else waited to scrub your feet with vinegar-soaked cloths. The poor, they made do. Rivers, barrels, ponds. If it held water and didn't smell like something had died in it, and even that was flexible, it was fair game. Sometimes you'd wash your shirt, your child, and your goat in the same bath because fuel was expensive, time was short, and the goat probably needed it most. Of course, winter changed the rules. You didn't bathe when the water turned to ice. You didn't strip down when your breath came out in visible puffs and your skin cracked from dryness. You survived. You prayed that the linen shirt underneath it all absorbed enough of your funk to keep the rats confused. But what if you had to bathe? What if you'd been injured or had to attend a noble feast or, God forbid, just smelled too strongly to be ignored? Enter the sponge bath. Except there were no sponges. Just linen cloths soaked in warm water, sometimes with herbs or vinegar. You wiped your face, your hands, your feet. The high traffic zones. If you were rich, someone else did it for you. If you were poor, you did it in the dark and hoped the damp rag hadn't been used to clean the dishes. These were not satisfying scrubs. They were gestures. Performative cleanliness. But hey, it was something. And in a world where disease lurked in the steam and the devil crouched in warm water, something was as good as it got. The irony? Many of these practices, the use of vinegar, herbal rinses, linen layers, had some merit. Vinegar has mild antibacterial properties. Herbs like lavender and rosemary repel certain insects. There was some logic buried beneath the fear. But logic rarely wins against theology, gossip, or plague. So the bath, once sacred, once social, was banished. Public soaking was scandalized. Private soaking was suspicious. And the act of bathing became an act of rebellion, of wealth, or of desperation. The water hadn't changed, only the meaning. And as the tub was boarded up, the people adapted. They dabbed. They powdered. And they waited for a better time, a safer century, or at least a breeze to shift the smell. The soap, we'll get to that. But first, the undergarments, the next layer of defense in this war on water. Let's pause and appreciate something mundane, something boring and utterly miraculous, the humble linen undergarment. In the medieval world, this wasn't just underwear. It was armor. Not against swords or arrows, but against stink, shame, and spiritual decay. To understand medieval hygiene, you need to abandon the modern fantasy of daily showers and fabric softener. There was no wash and wear. There was wear until it screams, then boil it with herbs and beat it against the rock until it stops. And even that was a luxury. Bathing might have become rare, but changing your linen underlayer? That, surprisingly, was common. By common, of course, we mean once a week if you're noble, once a month if you're not, and never if you're a shepherd with a strong tolerance for self-neglect. The idea was simple. Linen absorbs sweat, body oils, and the general effluvia of being a mammal. You wore it close to the skin, beneath your wool tunics and fur-lined cloaks, and you let it carry the burden of your existence. It was your sacrificial layer. And when it got too foul to handle, which it always did, you stripped it off, boiled it in a cauldron of lye or urine, and prayed it didn't disintegrate. Yes, you read that correctly. We'll get to that particular fragrant miracle in a later chapter. For now, just know that your fresh-smelling linen was likely baptized in someone's very old pee. Medieval laundry wasn't about gentle cycles. It was chemistry, violence, and faith. The nobility took this seriously. A white, crisp linen shirt was a status symbol. Not because it looked good, though it did, but because it announced to the world, I am clean enough to be taken seriously. My shirt is brighter than your morals. In portraits of the era, you'll often see nobles with a sliver of their linen collar peeking out from under their doublets. That wasn't a fashion accident. It was a calculated flex. A linen sleeve meant you had staff. A clean hem meant you didn't sweat like a pig in chainmail. But linen wasn't just for show. He had, in a world of unwashed outerwear, layers of wool, fur, and occasionally leather. The linen layer absorbed the punishment. You could wash it. You should wash it. Washing your body? Risky. Washing your shirt? Heroic. For women, the shift or chemise served the same purpose. Worn beneath dresses, it protected the expensive outer layers from perspiration, menstrual blood, nursing leaks, and the general indignities of being alive. In a culture that valued modesty and hated nudity, the shift was both a hygienic barrier and a social one. To be seen in only your shift wasn't scandalous, it was intimate, like being seen in pajamas, or in a bath, or thinking about a bath, which was practically a sin. Shifts, like shirts, were made of linen and occasionally wool. Linen was ideal, breathable, moisture-wicking, and surprisingly durable. A well-made shift could last years, passed down from mother to daughter, crust and all. But owning multiple shifts, that was wealth. Most peasants had one, which meant you didn't change so much as rotate. While one dried by the fire, preferably not catching fire, you wore the other. If you were lucky. Men's undergarments, by contrast, were less dignified. The medieval brace, essentially linen shorts tied at the waist, were loose, floppy, and prone to mishaps. No elastic, no lycra, no dignity. Just drawstrings, friction, and hope. Under those, you wore nothing. Which meant that if your brace gave out during a harvest festival, you were going to become the talk of the village. For all the wrong reasons. Layered on top of the brace, a tunic. Then another tunic. Then perhaps a cloak. It was like wrapping yourself in increasingly smell-resistant layers of social acceptability, held together by God, buttons, and vague denial. Now, did people ever not wear underwear? Of course. This was the Middle Ages, not a utopia. Sometimes you didn't have the fabric. Sometimes your shift tore. Sometimes it was laundry day. And sometimes, frankly, it was just too hot. We have records of clergy scolding the faithful for skipping their underlayers, not because of hygiene, but because a tunic without a shift underneath might cling to your unmentionables, and that was clearly Satan's design. But those who did wear linen religiously often fared better in the long run. Why? Because linen, unlike wool or fur, could be washed with terrifying regularity. And that meant fewer lice, fewer rashes, and slightly fewer existential crises brought on by the smell of your own body. Even knights wore linen, beneath the chainmail, of course. It wasn't just to prevent chafing, though that was important. It was to catch the sweat and blood before it soaked into the metal and turn your armor into a mobile petri dish. If you were going to joust in the sun, the least you could do was not ferment inside your breastplate. Monks, too, wore linen. Under the woolen habit, against the vows of silence, beside the fear of hellfire. Always linen. It was a quiet act of discipline, a reminder that even in isolation and piety, one should not smell like goat stew. And so, the linen shirt became a symbol, not of wealth necessarily, but of effort, of decency. In a world where water was feared, soap was scarce, and moral purity was measured in layers, linen was a lifeline. But washing it? That was another story, and another chapter. Because the only thing harder than staying clean in the Middle Ages was laundering the evidence. Soap, in theory, is supposed to make you feel clean. In the Middle Ages, it mostly made you feel like you'd survived something. If you were lucky, your skin was merely stripped of its natural oils. If you were unlucky, it was stripped of your sins, your dignity, and possibly the top layer of your dermis. Let's begin with the recipe. Medieval soap was typically a combination of animal fat, usually pig or sheep, and lye. which was made by filtering water through wood ash. This wasn't some artisanal boutique bar with hints of almond milk and Himalayan salt.
You don't sell it.
This was a beige, waxy brick that looked like something you'd hurl at a Viking during a siege. And the smell? A curious mixture of burnt bacon, wet chimney, and faint existential dread. To make it, you needed patience, firewood, and a disregard for your own sense of smell. Fat was rendered in a pot until it liquefied. Ash was soaked to produce a caustic lye solution. Then both were mixed together, stirred until thick, and poured into molds or whatever random container you had lying around. After several days of curing, you were left with a hunk of material that could remove dirt, oil, and the joy of living, all in one go. This soap wasn't used often for the body. That would have been wasteful or dangerous, depending on your skin's relationship with boiling lye. Instead, it was reserved for laundering clothes, cleaning tools, or preparing for very important events. Weddings, church feasts, royal visits, or the unfortunate necessity of removing whatever your child had rolled in. Daily use? That was for the goats, and even they looked hesitant. For those who did risk using it on themselves, the ritual was cautious. You might rub it on a cloth, lather it gently on the hands, rinse it off with cold water, and then spend the next hour scratching because your skin had decided to revolt. This was not a refreshing citrus scrub. This was a mild chemical interrogation. But things weren't equally rough across Europe. In southern regions, particularly Spain, a more elegant variety emerged, Castile soap. Made from olive oil instead of animal fat, it was smoother, milder, and far more forgiving to the skin. Naturally, this meant it was expensive. Reserved for the upper class or imported with care, Castile soap was what you used when you didn't want to smell like the aftermath of a meat market fire. It became a kind of status symbol. I don't just clean, I clean luxuriously. Of course, the vast majority of people didn't have access to Castile soap. They had local bricks, the ones that looked like hardened regret. So instead of scrubbing their skin, most opted for alternatives, vinegar rinses, herbal infusions, or the reliable method of pretending they were clean and hoping others played along. But even soap had its moral complications. In some regions, washing too frequently with scented products was seen as indulgent, even suspicious. Why, after all, would someone want to smell better than God made them? What sins were they covering? What wicked thoughts were lurking under that faint aroma of rosemary? The church occasionally issued warnings about vanity and cleanliness, not cleanliness itself. Monks still had their scheduled wash days, but the desire to appear overly fresh. There was a sense that piety and pungency were, if not synonymous, at least occasional roommates. Better to smell of effort and wool than temptation and mint. And yet, even with all the warnings and difficulties, soap making remained a surprisingly widespread trade. Soap boilers operated in cities across Europe, working in foul-smelling workshops tucked away from the nicer parts of town, mostly because the stench could peel paint. The process created enough fumes to make a monk doubt the purity of his lungs. But the result? A necessary evil. Filthy clothes were tolerable. Filthy linens, less so. Filthy nobles? Unthinkable. Interestingly, some cities regulated soap production carefully. Not because they cared about public hygiene, perish the thought, but because the runoff could contaminate water supplies or ignite unfortunate explosions. You didn't want your neighborhood bakery catching fire because a soap boiler 2 doors down was experimenting with extra ash. Urban planning in the Middle Ages was, at best, optimistic. For the average medieval household, keeping soap on hand meant keeping order. A small bar for laundry stored away from curious children and desperate neighbors. You used it sparingly. You might not understand pH balance or bacteria, but you knew this stuff worked, terrifyingly so. It made things clean and it made skin cry. There were alternatives, of course. Herbal pastes made with crushed mint or chamomile, clay rubs, even fermented concoctions of stale bread and milk. all touted as gentler options for those who didn't enjoy the sensation of exfoliating with a caustic brick. Did they clean? Arguably. Did they make you feel clean? Possibly. Did they at least make you smell like something other than cooked onion and defeat? Often, yes. But nothing matched soap for sheer brute force. And when you needed it, truly needed it, it did the job. Before a feast, after a death, on holy days, or when the lice got too bold. Which brings us, inevitably, to hair. Because even if your skin was covered in layers of linen and your armpits soaked in wine vinegar, your scalp was a different battlefield entirely. And medieval hair? That was less a fashion statement and more a flammable halo of ambition, oil, and possibly breakfast crumbs. If medieval hair had a motto, it would be flammable but fragrant. Because contrary to popular belief, people in the Middle Ages didn't walk around with dreadlock bird nests unless they'd truly given up on society. Hair care, much like everything else in the medieval hygiene routine, was inconsistent, creative, and mildly terrifying. People did wash their hair, not often, and rarely with anything that today would pass for shampoo. The reasoning was as familiar as it was flawed. Too much washing could weaken you, invite illness and anger, whatever divine force was currently judging your bathing schedule. So instead of regular scrubbing, they turned to rituals that were part hygiene, part sorcery, and part desperate experiment. Let's start with the basics. What did they actually use? One of the more common solutions was lye soap. Yes, the same brutal bar used for scrubbing laundry and erasing sins. It definitely worked. It cut through oil, dirt, and dignity. But use it too often, and you'd end up with a scalp that looked like scorched earth. Many people found themselves caught in the eternal medieval paradox. Do you want hair, or do you want clean hair? To solve this, gentler concoctions emerged. Egg yolks were surprisingly popular. Not the whites, just the yolks. Applied to the scalp, they acted as a sort of nourishing cleanser. In theory, in practice, it meant sitting in a smoky hut with warm egg dripping down your neck, trying not to smell like an undercooked omelette. Then came the beer, not for drinking, though that was always an option, but for rinsing. Beer was slightly acidic, rich in yeast, and better smelling than most of the people applying it. Pouring warm ale on your hair gave it a glossy sheen and made you smell vaguely festive. This practice was especially common among those who had a bit of coin and access to brewed leftovers. If your scalp fizzed a little, that was just the Holy Spirit taking notice. Others used herbal infusions, rosemary, lavender, sage, and even nettle. Leaves were boiled into a rinse and then carefully poured through the hair. These rinses were popular in monasteries, where monks believed in natural remedies and the power of silence. Particularly useful when the mixture got in your eyes and you were trying not to curse. But the real tool of medieval hair care wasn't what you washed it with. It was how you maintained it between washes. Enter the comb. Combs were treasured objects. Made from wood, bone, or horn, they were often intricately carved and passed down as heirlooms. And they weren't just for vanity. They were lice removal devices, scalp massagers, status symbols, and daily necessities. A good comb could mean the difference between a livable scalp and an infestation that whispered, "You've lost control." People combed often. Not necessarily in private. Not necessarily with subtlety. Because they had to. Fleas were inevitable. And if you skipped the combing too many days in a row, your hair would begin to clump into what some records politely refer to as natural locks, and what others simply call a problem. To combat this, some shaved their heads entirely. This was common among monks, who saw hair as a distraction from God. It was also practical. Fewer hairs meant fewer homes for parasites. The downside, your bald head now got colder, so you wore a coif, a small linen cap, to preserve your warmth and your pride. Women, on the other hand, had an entirely different relationship with hair. Long hair was prized, romanticized, and often ritualized. A woman's hair was seen as both beautiful and dangerous, a symbol of fertility and temptation, which meant it needed to be controlled, concealed, and styled into oblivion. Braids, buns, veils, and headdresses were all part of the daily routine. A noble woman might spend hours getting her hair coiled and pinned by servants, only to have it covered immediately afterward. Because showing too much hair could be considered indecent, but not brushing it, equally scandalous. The line between virtue and filth was thin and made entirely of keratin. And lest you think the peasants were excluded from all this, think again. Even in the fields, women braided their hair, tied it with scraps of fabric, and washed it, sparingly, in barrels or rivers. They didn't have luxury, but they had pride. A clean braid was a small act of dignity, especially when the rest of you was covered in hay, mud, and last week's onion stew. There were also perfumes, or at least scented oils. These were rarely applied directly to the hair unless you were rich or reckless. More often, herbs were braided into hair strands, lavender for scent, rosemary to repel lice, marjoram because it sounded impressive. Your hair didn't just look alive, it smelled alive, and possibly edible. In fact, head coverings themselves served as part of the hygiene routine. Hats, hoods, veils, all helped shield the scalp from dust, sun, and the judging eyes of your neighbors. They also trapped sweat, which meant that removing your hood at the end of the day was less reveal and more releasing the kraken. Still, compared to bathing, hair care was relatively consistent. It didn't require full nudity, dangerous tubs, or confrontations with sin. It could be done quietly, even with a bit of flair. But no matter how much egg yolk you poured or rosemary you braided, one thing remained constant: the itch. Always the itch. Hair was the battlefield. Combs were the weapons. And in this war, no one ever truly won. They just scratched less aggressively. Speaking of itchiness, it's time we meet the real tyrants of medieval hygiene: the lice, the fleas, the bedmates you never invited but couldn't evict. To live in medieval Europe was to share your body. Not romantically, not metaphorically, biologically. If you had skin, it had tenants. And if you had hair, you had a whole village living rent-free on your scalp. Life here were not an occasional inconvenience. They were a certainty, like winter, like stepping in something suspicious near the market stalls. They didn't care if you were noble or poor, devout or sinful, crowned or crawling. If your body was warm and clothed, you were fair game. The medieval term for someone without lice was probably recently dead. But let's be clear, people weren't proud of their co-inhabitants. No one flaunted their personal flea circus. They scratched, they combed, accepted. It was not apathy, it was inevitability. Lice were the weather of the body. So how did they deal with it? The tool of choice was the lice comb, a small object of bone, horn, or wood, carved with teeth so close together they could catch even the most stubborn intruder. These combs were personal, often beautifully made, and deeply cherished. If medieval people had pockets, the lice comb would be right next to their rosary. Using it wasn't a casual affair. You parted the hair. You dragged the comb slowly and painfully through every inch of scalp, hoping to hear the satisfying or horrifying tick of resistance. Then you wiped it on cloth or tossed it into the fire. Some combs even had little compartments to catch the vermin. It was grooming, but also a kind of quiet warfare. And yet, combing was only half the battle. Your clothes were the real frontier. Lice didn't just hang out in hair. They nested in seams, hid in collars, laid eggs in the folds of your undergarments. Your beloved linen, the very thing protecting your outer tunic from sweat, was also hosting the next generation of tiny, bloodthirsty aristocrats. Which is why medieval illustrations occasionally depict people holding shirts up to the fire. This wasn't laundry. This was execution. Heat killed the eggs. At least that was the hope. Too little heat and the lice survived. Too much, and your only shirt burst into flames. It was a game of thermal chicken, played against creatures the size of a grain of rice. But lice were just the beginning. Fleas could jump. Fleas bit indiscriminately. Fleas spread plague. And fleas didn't care if you bathed once a year or once a month. Your ankle was delicious either way. They thrived in straw mattresses, in rushes scattered on the floor, in animal fur, in your socks, in your dreams. Fleas made you twitch in your sleep and question your existence by sunrise. So what did people do? They smoked them out. Burning herbs like rosemary, juniper, or wormwood in living spaces was common. Not for the smell, though that helped, but for the belief that smoke drove the fleas into exile. Homes reeked of scorched plants and mild desperation. It was not a relaxing atmosphere. People also tucked herbal sachets between bed linens. Small cloth bags filled with lavender, sage, or mint. The idea wasn't to kill the fleas. Nothing short of divine wrath could do that, but to confuse them, to hide your human scent behind something vaguely floral, to say, don't bite me, bite the rosemary. And still, they bit. Some resorted to shaving, especially monks. No hair, no home. Technically effective. Others began wearing multiple layers, not for warmth, but to create barriers. If the flea had to get through 2 shifts, a tunic, and a wool cloak just to find your skin, maybe it would give up. Maybe it would starve. Maybe it would bite someone else. You could also boil your clothes. This was perhaps the most effective method. Boiling water, when you had the firewood and patience, could kill lice, fleas, and everything in between. But it came with the risk of destroying your garments, especially if they were already thin from years of use and repeated laundering with medieval soap. Many a tunic died in noble combat against parasites. And then there were bedbugs, which we won't even describe in detail here because frankly, you've suffered enough. The point is, medieval hygiene wasn't just about looking presentable. It was about survival. It was about damage control. You weren't trying to be clean. You were trying to limit the infestation to a manageable ecosystem. A few live mice, acceptable. A few dozen, troubling. Crawling sensations at all hours of the night, time to rethink your entire approach to life. And yet, somehow, society functioned. People married, plowed fields, all while cohabiting with creatures that modern people would declare war on with industrial-strength chemicals and 3 visits from pest control. In medieval Europe, you didn't eliminate your bugs. You managed them. You outnumbered them. You tricked them with smoke, herbs, and hot iron. And when all else failed, you scratched and moved on. Next up, the facilities. Or, more accurately, the lack thereof. Because if you think your bathroom situation is rough, wait until you hear about the medieval toilet. Let's get one thing out of the way. The term medieval toilet is optimistic, generous, maybe even misleading. Because for most people in medieval Europe, going to the bathroom wasn't about privacy or comfort, it was about strategy, timing, and accepting defeat with grace. Let's start at the top. In castles and fortified manors, you might find the most advanced facilities of the time, the garderobe. A small stone room built into the outer wall, often high above the ground, featuring a wooden bench with a hole. Below it, nothing but open air and consequences. Some garderobes emptied into pits, others into courtyards. The best ones dropped directly into moats, because what better way to protect your stronghold than with a literal river of crap? You weren't just keeping invaders out. You were insulting them in every imaginable sensory dimension. Now, despite the glamorous architecture, the experience was far from luxurious. There was no seat warmer, no scented candles, no toilet paper, just a stone room, a biting draft, and the hope that your enemies weren't loitering below. And believe me, if you were a servant who had to clean the moat, you were the enemy. Some garderobes were cleverly disguised, tucked into turrets or hidden behind wooden panels. But they weren't sealed. They weren't soundproof. They certainly weren't ventilated, which means that castle corridors often carried faint echoes of digestive honesty. You couldn't always tell who was noble by their perfume, but their garderobe certainly left a signature. If you were a monk or lived in a well-funded monastery, you might enjoy a reredoter, a long communal latrine with seats lined in a row and a shared drain channel below. Think of it as the medieval version of an office bathroom with no dividers, no flushing, and no dignity. You did your business. You pondered mortality. And you tried very hard not to make eye contact with Brother Thomas across the way. But the vast majority of people, the peasants, the townsfolk, the ones who couldn't afford to poop above a moat, had fewer options. Most of them went outside, behind the barn, in the woods, in the ditch, in the designated area near the pigsty, wherever nature provided a patch of solitude and the breeze wasn't working against you. Some villages had communal pits, shared outhouses of varying quality, often just a wooden shack over a trench. No dignity. The walls might be marked with graffiti. The floor might creak. The smell might haunt your descendants. But it worked. In cities, space was tight and sanitation tighter, which brings us to the chamber pot, the MVP of medieval midnight emergencies. These ceramic or metal bowls were kept under beds, beside hearths, or tucked into corners. When nature called after dark, and remember, you had no electricity, no flashlight, and often no shoes. You reached for the pot, squatted carefully, and hoped it wasn't already full. Chamber pots were practical, immediate, and they came with a ritual, the morning toss. This is where things get theatrical. In many towns, waste was literally thrown out the window, with or without warning. But the polite thing, the expected thing, was to shout first. In England, the phrase was garde l'eau, a bastardization of French meaning watch out for the water. Of course, it wasn't water. It was urine, or worse. And if you were unlucky enough to walk under the wrong window at the wrong hour, you learned the value of overhangs and quick reflexes. Some cities developed drainage systems, shallow gutters along the center of the street meant to carry waste away. But in reality, these channels clogged, overflowed, and fermented into ankle-deep declarations of civic failure. Pigs often roamed freely, serving as walking garbage disposals. Children played dangerously close to mystery puddles. No one was safe. No one was clean. Toilet paper, you ask? Not quite. The medieval world had alternatives. Snow, if you were desperate, and or in Scandinavia. Wool scraps were a luxury. Linen bits, reused from clothing too ragged to wear, were more common. But most people used what was at hand, and that usually meant whatever was growing nearby and didn't bite. In monasteries, rules existed about cleaning oneself discreetly and with modesty. But outside the cloisters, the etiquette was more about not being noticed. You excused yourself. You disappeared behind a hedge. You returned pretending nothing happened. Everyone knew, and everyone pretended they didn't. Now, before you wrinkle your nose too hard, consider this. Some of the best documented ancient sanitation systems, Roman sewers, Islamic bathhouses, had fallen out of use by the Middle Ages. The knowledge wasn't entirely lost, but it had been deprioritized. Public health wasn't a concern. Smell wasn't shameful. It was simply the background hum of existence. In fact, the olfactory landscape of a medieval town square was something to behold. Between the fishmongers, the tanners, the livestock, the human waste, the smoke from cooking fires, and the occasional decomposing rat, your nose learned to adapt or abandon you entirely. Still, there were efforts. Some cities enacted regulations, requiring residents to collect their waste or at least aim better. Some banned chamber pot tossing during certain hours. Others designated night soil collectors, brave souls who gathered human waste and carted it away to be used as fertilizer. The pay was poor, the respect lower, the stench eternal. So no, the medieval world wasn't one giant open sewer. It was a network of negotiated disgust, managed through habit, denial, and the occasional bar of soap that didn't melt your hand off. And while they didn't have flush toilets, sanitation departments, or biodegradable wet wipes, they had something just as enduring, a shared tolerance for bodily function, odor, and the ever-present reality that everyone poops. Now, having completed our descent into the bowels of medieval architecture, let us pivot, gently, to something lighter. Let's talk about smell, not just where it came from, but how people tried, and mostly failed, to smell like something other than boiled regret. Let's begin with an uncomfortable truth. The Middle Ages did not smell good. That isn't a punchline, it's a fact. Your average medieval town or village had no sewage system, no air fresheners, and very few people who believed that scent and sin weren't somehow connected. So naturally, the result was. And yet, medieval people were not indifferent to smell, quite the opposite. They noticed. They judged. They strategized. Because in a world where filth was ambient and bathing was rare, how you smelled became a public performance. Enter the pomander, the Renaissance's answer to Axe body spray, if Axe were made by an alchemist in a monastery and cost as much as a cow. A pomander was a small, hollow sphere, usually made of silver or gold, worn on a chain or tucked into the folds of clothing. Inside it, a potent blend of herbs, spices, and resins. Cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, lavender, ambergris, all tightly packed into a perfumed fortress of the Nile. Think of it as a portable scent bubble. You didn't clean yourself, you masked yourself. And if the scent didn't overpower your stench, at least it provided plausible deniability. Some pomanders were ornately crafted with filigree openings, allowing their fragrances to waft gently toward whoever stood closest. Others looked like tiny medieval grenades, and in a way, they were. Aromatic weapons against the invisible enemy, social judgment. For those who couldn't afford pomanders, there were scented sachets, little bags of dried herbs sewn into clothing, tucked between bosoms, or hidden in hats. Ladies might braid rosemary or marjoram into their hair. Men would rub mint or sage into their beards. The goal was not cleanliness. The goal was aromatic misdirection. And let's not forget the real ingredient in some of the finest medieval perfumes, animal glands. Yes, one of the most prized scents of the time was civet, a musky oil extracted from the anal glands of the civet cat, a creature that had absolutely no say in the matter. This substance, mixed with floral oils or wine, was used in tiny quantities to create long-lasting perfumes. The result? A smell that was, at best, complex, and at worst, deeply upsetting to everyone involved, including the civet. Another favorite, ambergris, a waxy substance produced in the digestive tract of sperm whales. It floated ashore in chunks, smelled like briny incense, and was valued like gold. Used sparingly, it gave depth and longevity to perfumes. Used generously, it made you smell like a cathedral's underbelly. Why go to such lengths? Because smell was status. To smell of rose oil or even soap was to declare, I have money, leisure, and possibly access to a functioning bath. To smell like cloves was to say, I know people. I import things. To smell like nothing, that was suspicious. In an age when everything reeked, absence of odor was unnatural and often associated with death. This is why scent was also spiritual. Many believed that bad smells were signs of moral corruption. If you stank, perhaps it wasn't your hygiene, but your soul that needed scrubbing. Conversely, saints were said to emit sweet odors from their corpses, a miraculous odor of sanctity. It wasn't enough to be good. You had to smell good after death to really seal the deal. This belief ran deep. During the plague, doctors wore beak masks filled with scented herbs. Not for style, though let's admit, they were iconic, but to protect against miasma, the bad air thought to carry disease. Rosemary, garlic, juniper, vinegar-soaked sponges, all pressed into those elongated snouts to filter out death by sheer aromatic willpower. At home, people simmered herbs in pots, hung garlands of lavender in doorways, or sprinkled rose water on floors. Anything to fight the stench. Some recipes even called for boiling oranges with cloves and bay leaves, not to eat. God no, but to walk around the house with, hoping the smell would stick to your clothing. If it didn't. But it made you feel proactive. Of course, there were limitations. You couldn't afford real perfume unless you were noble. You couldn't import exotic oils unless you had ships. And you couldn't bathe unless you wanted to risk illness, immodesty, or eternal damnation. So people faked it. You dabbed vinegar behind your ears. You chewed cloves to mask breath that could flatten livestock. You waved a perfumed handkerchief near your nose in public, pretending it was for decorum, not survival. You leaned into the fantasy that smell was a choice, and if yours offended, it was a personal failure. In reality, everyone smelled. Even the queen, even the bishop, even the guy selling pickled herring next to the tanner stall. Smell was the common language of the era. The only thing you could do was modify the narrative. Yes, I reek, your lavender sachet whispered, but at least I reek artfully. And yet, there was a strange kind of community in this, a shared human experience. No one expected perfection. If you tried, if you rubbed thyme into your collar or dabbed wine on your wrists, that said something. That meant you cared. Because in medieval Europe, hygiene wasn't about being clean. It was about being civil. Being human in a world where nature constantly threatened to drag you back into the mud. But scent wasn't the only battlefield. The mouth? Oh yes, the mouth was another frontier entirely. And if you think medieval breath smelled like roses, buckle up. Let's begin with a visual. You're a peasant in 1327. You've just eaten a hearty stew of barley and salted pork. You wipe your mouth with the back of your sleeve, sit by the hearth, and, in a sudden burst of self-reflection, you wonder, should I clean my teeth? And then you remember, you don't have a toothbrush. Or really much of a concept of oral hygiene beyond don't let the tooth rot until it hurts. And so, like many others in your time, you reach for the tools you do have, a linen cloth, some ashes from the fireplace, and maybe a sprig of mint, if the goat didn't eat the last of it. Because, yes, medieval people did clean their teeth. They just did it in ways that would make a modern dentist faint. First, there was the rubbing method. You took a piece of rough cloth, ideally linen, though anything absorbent would do, dipped it in something abrasive. Salt, soot, crushed rosemary ash, charcoal, and scrub your teeth manually. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't minty, but it got the job done, or at least removed the top layer of shame. Then there were chewing sticks. Thin twigs from trees like hazel, birch, or elm were stripped of bark and chewed at one end until the fibers frayed into a brush-like tuft. You'd use this natural bristle to scrub your teeth and massage your gums. It was effective and tasted like tree. Wealthier folks might opt for fennel seeds, cloves, or cardamom, not to brush, but to chew and freshen the breath. These were luxury items, often traded across great distances. If someone in your village smelled vaguely spicy, odds were they were rich, foreign, or deeply insecure about their mouth. For rinsing, options varied. Vinegar, diluted wine, or even urine were used at times. Yes, urine, rich in ammonia, which medieval medicine believed could cleanse wounds, and, by extension, maybe a molar or two. Desperate times. Desperate smells. And yes, toothpaste, in the loosest possible sense, did exist. A paste might be made by grinding crushed eggshells, oyster shell ash, salt, and charcoal, mixed with honey, oil, or wine to form a gritty, aggressive blend. You applied it with a rag. And if your gums bled, well, that just meant it was working. But the goal was not a Colgate smile. It was survival. You wanted to keep your teeth in your head. If your breath didn't knock someone over, you were already winning. Whitening, not a concern. Cavity prevention, largely misunderstood. The metric was, is the tooth still there? Yes, fantastic. Now, when a tooth went bad, and they all did, eventually, you went to the nearest barber surgeon. These were the multitaskers of medieval medicine. They cut hair, they lanced boils, they set bones, and yes, they yanked teeth. No anesthetic, just a pair of tongs or fingers in ruler cases, a wooden chair, and the Lord's Prayer recited at high speed. Some patients were given strong wine to dull the pain. Others simply bit down on leather and screamed into the void. Dentists didn't exist. Tooth extraction was amputation, and it was over in seconds, depending on how stubborn your molar was. Afterward, you might rinse with salt water, wine, or holy water and hope the infection didn't set in. If it did, you prayed. Sometimes in that order, but despite all this, many medieval people had surprisingly decent teeth, especially compared to their 18th and 19th century descendants. Why? Less sugar, no Coca-Cola, no candy, no refined flour or sticky caramel to rot the molars. Their diets were coarse, fibrous, and mostly free of processed sweeteners. So ironically, while their breath may have been weaponized, their tooth decay rates were lower than you might expect. Farmers chewing on onions and black bread all day might smell like a walking soup pot, but they could still bite through leather when needed. In fact, one of the biggest oral hygiene challenges wasn't decay, it was grit. Bread was often baked with coarse ground flour that contained bits of stone from millstones. Over time, this wore down enamel like sandpaper. Archaeological remains frequently show flat, worn teeth ground down by years of chewing rocks disguised as food. And let us not forget tooth blackening, a cosmetic practice seen in some Asian cultures during the medieval period, and sometimes adopted in Europe's later centuries by aristocrats who painted their teeth to hide decay. But in medieval Europe proper, there was little shame in a crooked grin. If you still had teeth, you smiled. If not, you gummed your stew and minded your own business. Kissing, meanwhile, was. Courtship often involved gloves, poetry, and long walks, not close-range breath exchanges. And if a kiss did happen, it was usually brief. Because intimacy was one thing, halitosis, base trauma, quite another. Still, in a world without mouthwash, toothpaste, floss, or dental insurance, people made do. They adapted. They rinsed with wine. They chewed mint. They hoped the pain went away before the tooth did. And when all else failed, they kept their mouths shut. Not out of modesty, but for structural reasons. Now, let's pull back and take in the full medieval ambiance. We've addressed the body, the hair, the mouth, and the pests. But there's still the atmosphere, the environmental aroma of the Middle Ages, the background funk, the city scent, the olfactory symphony of a time before Febreze. Imagine for a moment that you're transported to the center of a medieval city, let's say London, around the year 1350. The bells are ringing, the market is waking, the sun is rising over slanted rooftops. And before you can even take in the cobbled streets or admire the cathedral tower, the smell hits you like a fist made of soup, sweat, and slow decay. This wasn't just a bad day. This was the baseline. Because medieval cities didn't just smell unpleasant, they were aromatic catastrophes. A perpetual stew of humanity, livestock, rot, and heat. And the thing is, no one thought it was particularly odd. You see, when everything smells awful, nothing stands out. Your nose either adapted or filed for early retirement. Let's begin with the obvious. No sewers. Most cities had little in the way of organized waste removal. At best, there were open gutters, shallow ditches running along the middle of the road, meant to carry away rainwater. But they didn't just carry water. These gutters became the city's default plumbing system, ferrying away urine, feces, animal entrails, blood from the butcher, gray water from cooking, and anything else you could physically toss. And if it didn't rain, well, congratulations. The gutter became a fermentation trench, a slow, viscous ooze of every bad decision made within a 100-yard radius. In summer, it baked. In winter, it froze into a slick of sins. And then came the animals. Pigs, for instance, weren't just barnyard background characters. They were the medieval garbage disposal, roaming freely through city streets, snorting around for offal and refuse. They ate everything: rotten bread, spoiled meat, human waste, the occasional boot. Then they contributed generously to the street with their own droppings, which mingled nicely with the horse manure, dog scat, and feathers from dead birds that no one had the time to move. Cows and horses were tethered near homes or walked through markets. Chickens roamed freely. Rats scurried through cellars and alleys, thriving in a world where cleaning was more theory than practice. And each of these animals had a distinct odor, a signature scent that added to the urban bouquet. Now add in the people. We've established by now that bathing was rare, linen was sacred, and deodorant was imaginary. The average city dweller was coated in layers of wool, sweat, smoke, and the emotional residue of 4 decades of silent suffering. Their clothes weren't washed regularly. Their feet were often soaked, cold, or moldy. And their breath, a terrifying cocktail of garlic, plague wine, and dental despair. In markets, you might encounter sellers shouting over barrels of salted fish, their aprons covered in scales and brine. Next to them, a tanner might be hauling a bucket of urine-soaked hides to dry. And next to him, a woman selling cheese so aged it might qualify for citizenship. The market square was a place of commerce, yes, but also of olfactory combat. Tanneries, in particular, were urban scent factories. The process of turning animal skin into usable leather involved soaking hides in urine, lime, and dog feces. Then they were scraped, dried, and oiled, often right in the heart of town. One can only imagine the smell of a leather workshop in August, and then be grateful that modern smell of vision hasn't yet been invented. Inside the homes, the picture wasn't much rosier. Ventilation was poor. Fires were smoky. Bedding was made of straw and infested with fleas. Floors were covered in rushes or straw that weren't changed often, and when they were, it was usually just piling fresh ones on top of the old. Underneath, spoiled food, mouse droppings, vomit, and things best left uninvestigated. Every wall, every beam, every plank absorbed the scent of stew, sweat, and centuries of mild panic. Homes didn't smell of family and hearth. They smelled of containment. But here's the key people noticed. They might not have had germ theory or sanitation departments, but they had noses, and they used them. Which is why cities developed their own routines of denial and damage control. Herbs were scattered across floors. Flowers were hung above doorways. During feast days or royal visits, streets were swept, sometimes, and doused with rosewater or vinegar. Sand or straw was thrown over spills in the marketplace to soak up the horror. And the truly noble carried pomanders or perfumed gloves just to breathe through the chaos. Some cities went as far as to employ rakers, early sanitation workers who would clean out gutters, collect human waste, and cart it to the outskirts of town to be used as fertilizer. These men were paid, but not much. Their job was vital, dangerous, and profoundly disgusting. But someone had to move the filth, and it wasn't going to be the bishop. Still, there were laws. Municipal ordinances existed to limit chamber pot tossing to nighttime hours or to restrict dumping near wells and churches. But enforcement was rare, and practicality often won out. If you had a bucket of excrement and no backyard, the window became your ally. With or without the traditional shout of "Gardes l'eau," watch out for the water. So how did people cope? They stopped noticing. Or, more accurately, they developed scent hierarchies. Smelling bad was acceptable. Smelling worse than usual was alarming. If someone reeked above the norm, it meant disease, death, or demonic influence. Otherwise, your stench simply blended into the collective city haze, like smoke in a tavern or guilt in a confessional. Because in the end, the smell of a medieval city wasn't just offensive, it was alive. It was a map of the day's activity. It told you who had cooked, who had butchered, who had died, and who had been too lazy to dump their pot before dawn. You didn't need to see. You could smell the story unfolding. And so the city pulsed and stewed and sweated on. Not because it wanted to, but because it had to. Because this was what happened when thousands of people lived together without plumbing, refrigeration, or shame. Still, there were holdouts, tiny pockets of defiance, places where water still flowed, soap was used, and people dared to bathe. The last bathhouses, the final strongholds of cleanliness, before they too were shut down by fear, morality, and a growing suspicion that warm water might open the gates to hell itself. Picture a building on the edge of town, its windows fogged, its walls sweating, its roof leaking the smell of cedar wood, burning herbs, and inside, it is warm. Unnaturally warm. Because within these walls, unlike the rest of medieval life, people are naked. Welcome to the public bathhouse, the medieval equivalent of a spa, a tavern, a dating service, and a religious dilemma, all rolled into one. Contrary to what you might expect, the Middle Ages loved a good soak. Especially in the early medieval period, after the fall of the Roman Empire, but before the full hysteria of plagues and puritanical morality swept across Europe like a wet wool blanket. Cities had bathhouses, and some were quite elaborate. In 12th century Paris, dozens were scattered throughout the city. In the Islamic world, the hammam thrived, not just as a cleansing ritual, but as a deeply spiritual and social experience. Even Christian monasteries had dedicated bath buildings, complete with heated rooms, cold plunges, and scripts to read while waiting for your turn. Cleanliness, for a time, was considered next to godliness. But as with most things in history, it got complicated. You see, the bathhouse was never just about bathing. It was a place to gather, gossip, drink, dine, and yes, flirt. Mixed gender bathing was common in many regions of Europe until the late 14th century. Husbands and wives bathed together. Strangers became less strange in the steam. You could order a meal while soaking. You could hire a barber. You could make a business deal. You could, depending on the establishment, make a baby. Naturally, this made some people nervous. Moralists, never ones to miss an opportunity to panic, began raising concerns. Sermons warned of the bathhouse as a house of Satan's steam, where the boundary between cleanliness and carnal temptation was dangerously slippery. Pun, very much intended. Priests observed that too many people left the bathhouse with cleaner skin but dirtier thoughts. Then came the plague. The Black Death, that frequent visitor of our series, struck Europe in the mid-1300s and shook the very foundations of how people understood cleanliness. Because at first it seemed logical, disease is filth, and bathing removes filth. Therefore, bathing is good. Right? Wrong. At least, according to the medical thinkers of the time. In the confused and terrified aftermath of the plague, a new idea took hold, that water, especially hot water, opened the pores of the body. And with open pores came danger, miasmas, corrupt airs, evil vapors. Bathing, once seen as protective, was now suspected of making one more vulnerable to disease. This belief was reinforced by bad timing. In towns where bathhouses were popular, disease often spread rapidly, not because of the bathing itself, but because bathhouses brought people together in tight, sweaty rooms full of shared towels, unwashed hands, and gossip. But nuance was not the strong suit of the 14th century panic response. And so, slowly, the bathhouse became a scapegoat. What followed was a period of decline, suspicion, and semi-public nudity. Mixed bathing was outlawed in many places. Bathhouses were shuttered, repurposed, or burned down. Where they remained, they were often rebranded as sweat houses or healing rooms, stripped of their former sensual flair. Bath attendants, once respected professionals, were now whispered about in the same breath as prostitutes. And in some regions, they were literally the same people. Because, yes, as bathhouses became more secretive, they also became more illicit. Some establishments pivoted. Instead of hygiene, they offered hospitality. Patrons came less for soap and more for sin. And in the eyes of the authorities, the two became inseparable. To bathe was to flirt with temptation, or worse, with syphilis. By the late Middle Ages, especially in Northern Europe, regular bathing was no longer seen as virtuous. It was indulgent, in some extreme views, suspiciously Islamic, an echo of the thriving bathhouse culture of Muslim Spain and the Ottoman Empire, which had maintained far more advanced hygiene standards than their Christian neighbors. In short, bathing had become foreign, feminine, and morally ambiguous. A triple sin in many eyes. The irony, of course, is that during this whole decline, people still needed to get clean. So, what did they do? They pivoted to dry hygiene. Instead of baths, there were powders, perfumes, linen cloths, and the old faithful, changing your shirt. Some continued to bathe in secret, especially the wealthy, who could afford private tubs and guards to make sure the bishop didn't show up unannounced. Peasants, they kept washing in rivers, but less often and never without a prayer against demons entering through their knees. In some regions, the bathhouse never fully vanished. Japan, the Middle East, parts of Southern Europe. These places held onto the belief that cleanliness and purity were spiritual siblings. But in much of medieval Christendom, the age of the bathhouse slowly evaporated into myth and suspicion. And so, the bathhouse, once a steamy temple of refreshment and sociability, became a symbol of something lost, of cleanliness exchanged for fear, of community replaced with isolation, of soap swapped for silence. Because when the bathhouse door closed, something else crept in. The idea that to be truly pure, one must be untouched, not just by filth, but by pleasure, warmth, and comfort. But we're not done yet. Before we close our dirty little saga, there's one more layer to scrub through. A final insult to the already injury-ridden legacy of medieval hygiene, how it ended up being judged, mocked, and misrepresented by the centuries that followed. The tale ends where many modern minds begin, with the joke, the kind you've probably heard 1,000 times, about how medieval people didn't bathe, how they used leeches for toothpaste, and how everyone lived in a constant fog of body odor, chamber pot fumes, and bad decisions. It's tempting, it's funny, and like most good jokes, it hides a grain of truth. But the rest? That part is, well, historical slander. You see, somewhere between the Enlightenment and the age of the internet, we collectively decided that the Middle Ages were dirty, dumb, and disgusting, while we are clean, clever, and chemically lemon-scented. But this oversimplification tells us more about modern anxieties than it does about medieval filth. Because the truth is this, medieval people weren't clueless. They were contextual. They worked with what they had, in a world without germ theory, toothpaste ads, or mint-flavored anything. And within that world, they developed customs of hygiene that made sense, even if they wouldn't pass a modern health inspection. They washed their hands before meals. They used cloths and scrapers to clean themselves. They scented their homes, changed their linens, worried about fleas, and debated the moral risks of nudity in bathhouses. They valued cleanliness. It just looked different than ours. So, why the myth? Part of it comes from the Renaissance and Enlightenment thinkers, who defined themselves in opposition to what came before. To make their own world look better, they painted the medieval one as darker, more ignorant. Then came the Victorians, who had a complicated relationship with their own bodies. They revived soap as a civilizing force and built elaborate rituals around cleanliness, but also liked to feel morally superior to their ancestors. For them, the dirty Middle Ages became the perfect cautionary tale. Wash your hands, or you'll end up like those people. Later still, Hollywood arrived and sprinkled in manure for authenticity. Knights trudged through mud. Princesses slept in drafty towers surrounded by moss. Everything was gray, wet, and vaguely depressing. Because nothing says authentic medieval like grime and dysentery. And so the stereotype stuck that medieval people didn't bathe, didn't care, and didn't know. But this does them a disservice. Because if you look closely, not just in the castles and the cathedrals, but in the wills, recipes, sermons, and poems, you find a society trying. Not succeeding always, but trying. To stay clean, to smell better, to honor the body while fearing the soul's corruption. To find balance between comfort and caution, between physical relief and spiritual risk. And really, are we so different? We too live in a world where hygiene is moralized, where certain odors are demonized, where soap is marketed not just as cleansing, but as redemptive, where some people bathe obsessively and others not enough, where access to hygiene is still, disturbingly, a matter of class. We flush our waste away and pretend it disappears. We wash with water from distant sources and never ask where it goes. We drench ourselves in perfumes to erase the evidence of exertion, anxiety, or aging. We have electric toothbrushes, ultrasonic facial wands, and exfoliating serums made of volcanic ash. But how many of us would survive a week without plumbing? Perhaps the laughter directed at the Middle Ages is a nervous one. A laugh of distance, of relief, of pretending that our own fragility is no longer a problem, that we've solved the riddle of dirt and disease, that we no longer live at the mercy of bacteria, pandemics, or failing infrastructure. But if the last few years have taught us anything, it's that hygiene is still a frontier, that toilets still clog, that hands still spread illness, that fear of contagion can still shape societies, stigmatize the vulnerable, and close down entire economies, that access to water and soap is still not universal. So maybe, just maybe, our ancestors don't deserve the mockery. They deserve understanding, and maybe even a little admiration, because in a world of mud and misfortune, they still try to stay clean, with vinegar, intention. And let's be honest, some of them probably smelled better than the guy next to you on the subway. So the next time someone jokes about how people in the Middle Ages only bathed once a year, you can nod politely, and then explain in great detail how bathing cycles were often seasonal, how linen underlayers absorbed oils, how Islamic bathhouse culture preserved Greco-Roman hygiene traditions, and how moral panic, not stupidity, shut down the bathhouses of Europe. You can do that. Or you can just smile and remember, history isn't dirty. It's human.